When the fires finally dimmed across Palestine in 1260, the Mongol banners were already gone. They had crossed mountains that had stopped Alexander, crushed cities that had survived since before Christ walked the earth, and then vanished like smoke, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt like the world had stopped breathing. But something had broken in that silence. Not walls, not armies, something deeper. Faith itself had been shattered in ways that medieval chroniclers struggled to write about, their quill hands trembling as they tried to find words for what they'd witnessed. Most histories of the Mongol conquests focus on the obvious stuff, the cavalry tactics, the siege engines, the empire that stretched from the Pacific to the Mediterranean in less than a century. But hidden between those lines, buried in fragments of letters and half-burned manuscripts, is another story entirely. One about what happens when the world's most efficient killing machine discovers that destroying hope is more effective than destroying cities. And the laboratory where they perfected this technique, the convents of the Holy Land, where women who had devoted their lives to God learned that sacred walls meant absolutely nothing to men who worshipped only victory. By 1258, the Crusader states were already dying. Jerusalem had been lost decades earlier. Acre stood as Europe's last glittering outpost on the edge of a world that wanted it gone. And scattered across this contested landscape were dozens of convents, small fortified islands of prayer and order in an ocean of constant warfare. These weren't just churches with women in them. They were the invisible infrastructure that kept the Crusader world functioning. The sisters who ran hospitals for pilgrims also carried encrypted letters between nobles, copied and translated manuscripts in 6 languages, and maintained the only reliable intelligence network in the region. They knew which roads were safe, which wells were poisoned, where armies were moving, and who was planning to betray whom. They were the medieval equivalent of a communications network, a postal service, and a spy agency, all rolled into one, hidden behind the unthreatening facade of women at prayer. When Mongol scouts first entered the region in the late 1250s, they noticed this immediately. Because the Mongols didn't just conquer, they studied. They had intelligence officers who could speak a dozen languages, cartographers who mapped not just terrain but social structures, and commanders who understood that information was more valuable than gold. And they recognized that these convents weren't just religious buildings, they were the nervous system of an entire civilization. So when the conquest began, the Mongols didn't just attack fortresses. They began systematically targeting the places where faith was administered, where hope was manufactured, where the idea of divine protection was kept alive. And they did it with a precision that would make modern psychological warfare experts take notes. The Mongols had spent decades perfecting the science of terror. They'd learned it on the steppes, where survival meant understanding exactly how much fear to inspire in your enemies. They'd refined it in China, where they discovered that one horrifying massacre could make 10 cities surrender without a fight. And they'd perfected it in Persia, where they'd turned terror into a bureaucratic process, complete with officers who specialized in calculating the exact level of atrocity needed to break a population's will. They measured fear like engineers measure stress on a bridge. They observed which acts made cities open their gates, which displays of mercy bought loyalty, and which specific horrors traveled fastest through rumor and legend. It wasn't random brutality. It was applied psychology centuries before psychology existed as a discipline. When they reached the Holy Land, they brought this expertise with them, and they immediately recognized an opportunity that previous conquerors had missed. The Crusader world ran on faith, not just religious faith, but faith in the idea that God protected the righteous, that sacred spaces were inviolable, that women devoted to prayer existed outside the normal rules of warfare. If the Mongols could shatter that belief, the entire structure would collapse without them having to fight for every castle and town. So, they began to target the symbols, the monasteries, the pilgrimage sites, and especially the convents, where the contradiction between sacred protection and human vulnerability was most stark. Contemporary records, the ones that survived, tell us about one house in particular. The convent of St. Catherine, located about 3 miles from Acre, behind 12-foot walls of pale limestone, surrounded by olive groves that had been there since Roman times. Inside lived approximately 40 sisters, most of them daughters of Crusader knights, women who'd chosen or been chosen for religious life. They'd seen wars before. They'd nursed wounded soldiers, buried plague victims, and prayed through sieges. But none of them understood what kind of enemy was approaching. In early 1260, Mongol riders appeared on the horizon. And then they did something that terrified the sisters more than an immediate attack would have. They did nothing. For 3 days, the riders simply circled the convent at a distance, visible enough to be seen clearly, silent enough to let imagination fill the void. They lit no fires, launched no arrows, made no demands, sent no messengers. They just watched. It was psychological warfare at its most elegant. The Mongols had learned that anticipation of horror is often more effective than horror itself, that the human mind, given time and silence, will conjure fears worse than reality. Chroniclers later wrote that by the 3rd day, the convent's bells rang constantly, not for prayer times, but because the sisters couldn't bear the silence between the walls and the watching riders. Some of the younger women stopped eating, others prayed until their voices gave out. The abbess sent desperate messages to Acre, but the city's garrison was already stretched thin, and no one wanted to risk soldiers for a convent that might already be lost. Then, as suddenly as they'd appeared, the riders vanished. The sisters thought they'd been spared. They thought their prayers had been answered, that God had turned away the storm. They were wrong. The reprieve was part of the design. The Mongols had learned that hope, when crushed after being briefly restored, breaks people more completely than constant despair. 3 weeks later, a full Mongol host appeared. Not a scouting party, but a coordinated force with siege equipment and officers who'd studied the convent's layout. They attacked at dawn, not with the chaotic fury of raiders, but with the methodical efficiency of men following a plan. The walls, which had stood for 80 years, fell in less than 4 hours. And what happened next was so carefully calculated, so precisely executed, that it's clear the Mongols weren't acting on impulse or rage. They were following a protocol. The sisters were not killed immediately. That would have been too simple, too quick, too forgettable. Instead, they were separated into groups based on age and status. The abbess and senior sisters were kept in the chapel, forced to watch as the younger women were led away. The Mongols understood symbolism. They knew that desecrating a holy space while its guardians watched helpless was more psychologically devastating than simple murder. They knew that survivors who could tell the story were more valuable than corpses who couldn't, and they knew that what they did in this one convent would echo across every Christian community in the region. Contemporary accounts, written by survivors and witnesses who reached Acre, are fragmentary and often coded in euphemistic Latin. Medieval chroniclers didn't have vocabulary for systematic sexual violence as a military tactic. They wrote around it using phrases like suffered dishonor and endured unspeakable acts and were subjected to the customs of the pagans. But the pattern is clear. The Mongols weren't acting out of lust or lack of discipline. This was policy. Officers supervised. Specific women were targeted in specific orders. And witnesses were deliberately left alive to carry the story. One letter, preserved in the Vatican archives, was written by a bishop who interviewed survivors weeks later. His handwriting deteriorates as the letter progresses, becoming almost illegible by the end. He describes women who couldn't speak, who flinched at sudden movements, who'd stopped praying because they couldn't reconcile what had happened with the God they'd served. He describes one sister, a woman named Agnes, who'd been at the convent for 15 years, who told him that the worst part wasn't the violence itself. It was that the Mongol officers had laughed while it happened, Not cruel laughter, not mocking laughter, but casual laughter, the kind you hear at a tavern or a market. As if what they were doing was ordinary work, no different from shoeing a horse or repairing a saddle. That detail, more than any description of physical harm, reveals the true horror. The Mongols had industrialized atrocity. They'd turned it into a job that men could perform without emotion, following procedures, achieving objectives. After approximately 6 hours, the Mongols left. They didn't occupy the convent. They didn't steal much. Just some silver candlesticks and a few manuscripts. They didn't burn the buildings completely, just enough to make them unusable. And they left the gates open, making it clear that anyone could leave, that there was no point in staying. Because the convent, as an idea, as a symbol of divine protection, had been destroyed more thoroughly than fire ever could. Within days, the story had spread to every Christian community in Palestine. Not through official channels, but through the whisper network of servants, merchants, and refugees. And the story grew in the telling, became more detailed, more horrifying, until no one could be sure what was true and what was embellishment, which was exactly the point. The Mongols understood that uncertainty amplifies fear, that a story people half believe but can't verify is more powerful than documented fact. Within 2 weeks, 3 other convents had evacuated voluntarily. Within a month, the entire network of religious houses between Acre and Jerusalem had collapsed. Not because the Mongols attacked them, but because the sisters and monks couldn't trust that their walls meant anything anymore. Military historians often focus on the Mongols' cavalry tactics, their composite bows, and their logistics. But the real innovation was this: they'd figured out how to weaponize meaning itself. They didn't just destroy buildings, they destroyed the idea that buildings could protect you. They didn't just kill people, they killed the belief that certain people were protected by divine law. And once that belief died, resistance became pointless. Why defend a fortress if fortresses don't matter? Why trust in God's protection if God's own servants can't be protected? The psychological impact was catastrophic in ways that took decades to fully manifest. Letters from Crusader nobles to European monarchs begging for reinforcements take on a desperate, almost unhinged quality after 1260. They're not just asking for soldiers, they're asking for proof that the world still makes sense, that the rules they'd built their lives around still apply. One letter, from a French count to his brother in Paris, includes a line that's haunted historians for centuries. "We no longer know what God wants from us, or if he watches at all." That wasn't just a crisis of faith, it was a crisis of civilization, because the Crusader states weren't held together by military might, they were held together by shared belief. The belief that they were doing God's work, that their suffering had meaning, that sacred spaces and sacred people existed outside the normal brutality of medieval warfare. The Mongols had identified the load-bearing wall of that entire structure and demolished it with surgical precision. But here's what makes this even more disturbing. The Mongols kept records. Not detailed narratives, but operational notes, the kind of bureaucratic documentation that reveals how systematically they approached conquest. Fragments of these records, translated from Persian and Mongolian, survived in archives from Tabriz to Beijing, and they show that Mongol commanders literally took notes on these operations. How long did panic take to spread after an attack on a religious site? How many nearby settlements surrendered without resistance? What was the optimal level of violence needed to achieve maximum psychological impact with minimum resource expenditure? They were running experiments, testing variables, refining their methods based on measurable outcomes. One document, a report from a Mongol officer to his superior, discusses the convent attacks in the same tone you'd use to describe crop yields or bridge construction. It notes that attacks on female religious communities produced faster capitulation rates than attacks on male monasteries. theorizes that this is because women were seen as more vulnerable and therefore their suffering more meaningful, and recommends prioritizing such targets in future campaigns. There's no moral judgment in the text, no awareness that what's being described is monstrous. It's just data, analysis, optimization. This is what separates the Mongol approach from ordinary wartime atrocity. Most armies throughout history have committed horrific acts, but usually as breakdowns in discipline, explosions of rage, or opportunistic cruelty. The Mongols systematized it. They turned terror into a technology, complete with specialists, protocols, and performance metrics. And they did it so effectively that they conquered more territory in 25 years than Rome did in 4 centuries, often without fighting at all. Because once word spread about what happened to those who resisted, most cities just opened their gates. The cost-benefit analysis was simple: surrender and maybe survive. Resist and definitely suffer something worse than death. When you put it in those terms, when you make the horror predictable and the mercy conditional, you don't need to conquer every city. You just need to conquer enough of them in the right way, and the rest conquer themselves through their own fear. The aftermath of the convent attacks rippled outward in ways the Mongols probably didn't fully anticipate, though they certainly exploited them. Within the Christian communities of the Holy Land, a theological crisis erupted that the Church had no framework to address. Could a woman who'd taken vows of chastity still be considered a bride of Christ after being violated? Could she return to religious life? Was she still holy, or had she been permanently corrupted? These weren't abstract questions. They determined whether survivors could be readmitted to religious communities, whether they could receive support from the Church, whether they had any place in society at all. And the Church's response was, to put it mildly, catastrophically inadequate. Some bishops argued that the women were martyrs who'd suffered for Christ and should be honored. Others suggested that they'd been tested and found wanting, that truly faithful women would have chosen death over dishonor. Still, others proposed that the women were now spiritually compromised and should be segregated from the faithful to prevent contamination. There was no consensus, no official doctrine, just confusion, contradiction, and a lot of women left in limbo, neither fully accepted nor fully rejected, existing in a grey zone that medieval society had no category for. Letters from this period, preserved in monastic archives, are heartbreaking in their desperation. One woman, identified only as Sister Marguerite, wrote to her family in France explaining that she could no longer return to religious life because her convent wouldn't take her back. But she also couldn't return to secular life because she was still technically bound by her vows. She was legally and spiritually trapped, belonging nowhere, recognized by no community. Her letter ends with a question that has no good answer. If God could not protect me in his own house, how can I trust that he exists anywhere? Another letter, from a priest in Acre to his bishop, describes finding 3 former sisters living in a storage room behind a church, too ashamed to be seen in public, surviving on charity from a baker who left bread outside their door at night. The priest asks for guidance on how to help them. The bishop's response, if there was one, hasn't survived. Probably because there was no good answer. The institutional church, for all its power and theology, had no protocol for this. They could handle martyrs who died gloriously. They could handle sinners who repented. But they had no category for women who'd done nothing wrong, yet were treated as if they had, who'd kept their faith, yet been abandoned by the God they served. Some survivors tried to rebuild. A few managed to find acceptance in hospitals and charitable houses, working anonymously among the poor, their past erased or ignored. Others disappeared into cities, married if they could, worked as servants or laundresses if they couldn't. A handful made it back to Europe, though the journey itself was dangerous and expensive, and arrival didn't guarantee acceptance. One woman, documented in the records of a French monastery, walked from Acre to Marseille over the course of 8 months. then spent 3 years petitioning church authorities for permission to enter a convent. She was finally accepted, but only after agreeing to serve a perpetual penance for her failure to preserve her purity, even though that failure consisted of being attacked by an invading army. She lived another 40 years in that convent, never speaking about what had happened, her story preserved only because a sympathetic monk recorded it after her death. But most survivors left no trace at all. No letters, no records, no graves with names on them. They simply vanished from history, absorbed into the anonymous mass of medieval poor, their stories lost, except as cautionary tales told by preachers who'd never met them. And that erasure was, in its own way, a continuation of what the Mongols had started. Because the goal wasn't just to harm these women. It was to make them unmentionable, to create a trauma so profound that society couldn't acknowledge it without confronting uncomfortable truths about divine protection and institutional failure. So instead, the stories were sanitized, turned into tales of martyrdom where women died heroically rather than survived broken, or ignored entirely, buried in euphemistic Latin that future generations couldn't or wouldn't translate. The Mongols had discovered something that would be rediscovered by every totalitarian regime in history. You don't need to kill everyone to destroy a community. You just need to create a wound so deep that the community destroys itself trying not to look at it. For the Crusader states as a whole, the loss of the convent network was catastrophic in ways that took years to become fully apparent. These institutions had been the invisible infrastructure that made everything else possible. They'd run hospitals that treated thousands of pilgrims annually. They'd maintained schools that taught languages and medicine. They'd operated scriptoriums that copied and preserved texts. They'd provided safe houses for travelers and refugees. And most importantly, they'd maintained the communication networks that allowed the scattered Crusader territories to function as a coherent entity. When that network collapsed, everything else began to fail. Supply routes that had relied on information from the sisters about road conditions and bandit activity became unreliable. Hospitals closed because there was no one to run them. Schools shut down. The flow of intelligence about enemy movements slowed to a trickle. Nobles who'd relied on encrypted messages carried by trusted sisters had to find new, less secure methods of communication. Alliances that had been maintained through careful correspondence began to fray. It wasn't a sudden collapse, it was a slow unraveling, like a tapestry coming apart, thread by thread. And the Mongols didn't even have to maintain a presence in the region to benefit from this. They'd struck once, devastated the infrastructure, and then moved on to other conquests, leaving the Crusader states to bleed out slowly. It was efficient in a way that's almost admirable if you can separate the method from the morality. Why occupy territory and deal with rebellions when you can simply break the enemy's ability to organize resistance and let entropy do the rest? Within 5 years of the convent attacks, Crusader-held territory had shrunk by a third, not because of military defeats but because towns and castles were simply abandoned. People fled to Acre or to ships heading back to Europe. The countryside emptied out. And when the Mamluks, the new power rising from Egypt, finally marched north to claim what was left, they found less an enemy to fight than a corpse to bury. The final fall of Acre in 1291, which officially ended the Crusader presence in the Holy Land, was almost anticlimactic. The walls were breached, the city was sacked, but the real defeat had happened decades earlier, in a dozen small convents that most people had never heard of. Military theorists who study this period often focus on the tactical brilliance of Mongol cavalry or the strategic genius of their logistics. But the real lesson is darker and more relevant. The Mongols proved that you can conquer not just territory, but meaning itself. That if you identify what gives a society coherence, what makes people believe their suffering has purpose, you can destroy that belief more effectively than you can destroy the people themselves. And once that belief is gone, The society collapses inward, consuming itself. It's a lesson that's been relearned throughout history, usually by people who've never heard of the Mongols, but who've independently discovered the same principles. You can see it in the deliberate targeting of cultural sites during modern wars, in the use of sexual violence as a weapon of ethnic cleansing, in propaganda campaigns designed not to convince, but to exhaust, to make people stop believing that truth exists at all. The methods change, the technology evolves, but the underlying logic remains the same. Break what people believe in, and you break the people. The Mongols didn't invent this. Armies have been committing atrocities since armies existed. But they were the first to approach it systematically, to study it, to refine it, to turn it into a reproducible method that could be taught to officers and applied consistently across different cultures and contexts. They were the first to understand that terror isn't just a side effect of war, it's a weapon that can be wielded with precision. And the Holy Land, with its complex mix of religions and cultures and its infrastructure built on faith, was the perfect laboratory for perfecting that weapon. The results were so effective that Mongol tactics influenced military thinking for centuries. Timur, who claimed descent from Genghis Khan, used similar methods in his conquests across Central Asia and the Middle East. Ottoman armies studied Mongol campaigns and adapted their psychological warfare techniques. Even European powers, when they began their colonial expansions, employed strategies that echo Mongol methods, targeting indigenous religious sites and leaders to break resistance. But there's another legacy, one that's harder to quantify but perhaps more important. The Mongol campaigns in the Holy Land fundamentally changed how people thought about divine protection. Before 1260, there was a widespread belief, not just among Christians but across many medieval cultures, that certain spaces and certain people existed outside the normal rules of warfare. That churches and temples were sanctuaries, that women devoted to religious life were inviolable, that some things were simply too sacred to touch. The Mongols shattered that illusion completely. They proved that nothing was sacred if you were willing to ignore the rules, and that ignoring the rules could actually be more effective than following them. The psychological impact of this realization rippled far beyond the immediate victims. It changed how people understood their relationship with the divine. If God wouldn't or couldn't protect his own servants in his own houses, what did that say about divine power, about divine interest in human affairs, about the entire structure of meaning that medieval society was built on? These weren't just theological questions debated by scholars. They were existential crises experienced by ordinary people whose entire worldview had been constructed around the idea that faith provided protection. Some people responded by doubling down on their faith, arguing that the attacks were tests or punishments that required even more devotion. Others quietly abandoned religion altogether, though they couldn't say so publicly in a society where atheism was literally unthinkable. Most people existed somewhere in between, going through the motions of religious practice while privately doubting whether any of it meant anything. You can see this shift in the art and literature of the period. Before the Mongol invasions, medieval Christian art typically depicted saints and holy figures as serene, protected, triumphant. After 1260, there's a noticeable increase in images of suffering, of martyrdom, of Christ's agony on the cross. The emphasis shifts from divine protection to divine suffering, from faith as shield to faith as endurance. It's as if the entire culture was trying to process a trauma it couldn't articulate directly. The convents themselves, the physical buildings, mostly disappeared. Some were destroyed completely. Others were abandoned and gradually dismantled by locals who needed building materials. A few were converted to other uses, their religious origins forgotten or deliberately erased. Archaeological excavations in the region occasionally uncover fragments, a foundation here, a piece of carved stone there, but nothing substantial. Nothing that would tell you what these places meant or what happened in them. which is fitting in a way. The Mongols didn't just destroy buildings, they destroyed memory. They created a silence so complete that even the physical evidence was swallowed up. But silence, as it turns out, isn't the same as absence. Local folklore in the region, passed down through generations of Palestinians and Israelis who have no connection to the medieval Crusaders, still contains strange echoes. Stories about places where nothing grows quite right, about ruins where people feel inexplicably uneasy, about sounds carried on the wind that might be prayers or might be something else. These stories aren't historically accurate, they're not even consistent. But they suggest that trauma, when it's profound enough, leaves marks that outlast memory, that persist even when the original context is completely lost. Modern historians studying this period face a unique challenge. The sources are fragmentary, often contradictory, and heavily filtered through the biases of medieval chroniclers who had their own agendas. Some scholars argue that the atrocities have been exaggerated, that medieval writers inflated the horror for propaganda purposes. Others contend that the surviving accounts, disturbing as they are, probably understate what actually happened because chroniclers literally didn't have language to describe systematic sexual violence as military policy. The truth is probably somewhere in between, though that's cold comfort. Whether the Mongols attacked 10 convents or 50, whether hundreds of women suffered or thousands, the fundamental reality remains the same. A military force identified a vulnerability in their enemy's social structure and exploited it with calculated brutality. They turned human beings into weapons, not by arming them, but by harming them in ways that would spread maximum fear with minimum effort. And it worked. It worked so well that within a generation, the entire Crusader presence in the region had collapsed, not primarily through military defeat, but through psychological disintegration. So what does this story mean for us, centuries later, in a world that likes to think it's moved beyond medieval barbarism? Maybe it's a reminder that the tools of conquest evolve, but the logic remains depressingly consistent. That every generation discovers new ways to break what people believe in, and that broken belief is more devastating than broken bodies. Or maybe it's a warning about the danger of building societies on faith alone, on the assumption that certain protections are guaranteed by divine or moral law, rather than by human commitment to uphold them. The medieval Christians of the Holy Land believed their convents were protected by God. They were wrong. Not because God didn't exist or didn't care, but because protection requires more than belief. It requires power, vigilance, and the willingness to defend what you claim is sacred. But there's also something else in this story, something harder to articulate but worth considering. The fact that we're talking about this now, that fragments of these women's stories survive despite every effort to erase them, suggests that silence is never quite complete. That even the most efficient campaigns of terror leave traces, that memory, however distorted and incomplete, persists. The Mongols tried to weaponize fear so thoroughly that resistance would become unthinkable. And for a time, it worked. But empires built on fear eventually collapse, while the stories of those who suffered outlast the empires that caused the suffering. The Mongol Empire, which once stretched across half the world, is gone. The Crusader states are gone. The medieval church that failed to protect its servants is gone. But somewhere in archives and archaeological sites, in folklore and fragmentary letters, the voices of those women still whisper, not loud enough to tell us exactly what happened, not clear enough to answer all our questions, but persistent enough to remind us that they existed, that they mattered, that their suffering wasn't meaningless, even if it felt that way at the time. History isn't just about what happened, it's about what we choose to remember and why. For centuries, the story of the Mongol conquest of the Holy Land was told as a tale of military genius and imperial expansion. The convents were footnotes if they were mentioned at all. But maybe the real story, the one that matters most, isn't about the conquerors and their efficient brutality. Maybe it's about the people who tried to maintain spaces of faith and healing in a world determined to destroy both. About the women who believed sacred walls could protect them and learned, in the worst possible way, that walls are just stones and protection is just a word unless someone is willing to fight for it. About the survivors who carried unbearable memories and somehow kept living anyway. Their names are mostly lost, their voices are mostly silent. But the fact that we can still glimpse their shadows, still sense their presence in the gaps of history, means that the Mongols didn't win completely. Terror can conquer empires, but it can't quite erase the human capacity to endure, to remember, and to insist, even centuries later, that what happened mattered. That the women who prayed in those convents mattered, that their faith, however misplaced, and their suffering, however forgotten, deserved to be acknowledged, not as propaganda, not as a lesson, just as the truth. Uncomfortable, incomplete, and impossible to look away from once you know it's there.